tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such, and yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
Canada does not dump lumber into the United States. And we will continue to make the case that these current and proposed duties are unjustified.
When Donald Trump declared that the United States didn't need lumber or cars from Canada, many dismissed it as another round of political bravado. But then came the tariffs. Practically overnight, Washington labeled Canadian lumber a national security concern and imposed heavy taxes on it. Markets reacted instantly. Prices shot up, surpassing $650 per thousand board feet, and the shock rippled through the housing sector. Construction costs soared, and projects that once promised profits began to stall. That single decision struck at the very core of America's housing system. Roughly 1/3 of the lumber used in US homes is imported, most of it from Canada. By taxing that supply lifeline, the administration turned a policy move into a full-blown shockwave for the housing market. Builders hesitated, home prices climbed beyond reach for many families, and experts warned that every price increase risked locking millions of Americans out of home ownership altogether. What began as an attempt to boost domestic jobs was now reshaping the foundation of the housing economy. Could a plan meant to strengthen the nation actually deepen its economic divide? Once the tariffs took effect, the numbers told an uncomfortable truth often left out of political speeches. Canada supplies about 12 billion board feet of softwood lumber to the US each year, roughly a quarter of the nation's total need. Even if every sawmill in America ran at full capacity, production would still fall short by more than 3 billion board feet. Analysts had long warned that replacing Canada's role in the supply chain was not a short-term fix. Even under ideal conditions, with new mills, a full workforce, and significant investment, it could take nearly a decade to close that gap. And that optimistic forecast assumes the US could find the resources and labor to expand production, something far from guaranteed. Most American mills already operate near their limits, running at around 95% capacity, often with aging equipment and chronic worker shortages. These constraints soon became visible across the entire housing market. Lumber costs rose faster than wages, squeezing contractors and forcing builders to pay more for every frame and beam. The effects rippled outward. Home prices climbed, construction slowed, and families who once hoped to buy were priced out. What started as an effort to protect domestic industry had become a burden on the broader economy. Each spike in lumber costs added strain to an already fragile housing system. The policy designed to secure American industry had instead fueled an inflationary wave that touched everything from construction sites to household budgets. Independence from Canadian imports now looked less like strength and more like strain, revealing how deeply the two economies were intertwined. While the US struggled with rising costs, Canada's leadership took a different path. Instead of retaliating, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government focused on adaptation. Ottawa introduced a $500 million initiative to help lumber producers diversify their markets and reduce reliance on American buyers. Soon after, another $1.2 billion package was rolled out to shield the industry from anti-dumping duties and boost competitiveness abroad. British Columbia's Minister of Forests, Ravi Parmar, announced an ambitious target: redirect at least 10% of lumber exports toward new global markets. Canada's response wasn't about confrontation, it was about reinvention. Officials framed the tariffs as an opportunity to rethink how the country's lumber industry could thrive globally. Provinces like British Columbia and Alberta, long dependent on steady US demand, became centers of modernization and investment. The government poured funding into innovation grants, trade missions, and infrastructure improvements to make exports faster and more efficient. What could have been a blow to confidence instead became a catalyst for transformation. As the US tightened trade barriers, Canada expanded its global network, strengthening its position in a world eager for stable and sustainable suppliers. For decades, about 90% of Canada's lumber exports went straight to the US, a dependence that once seemed unbreakable. But when tariffs disrupted that flow, Canadian producers looked outward and found opportunity elsewhere. Shipments began heading to South Korea, Vietnam, India, Australia, the UK, and markets across the Middle East and North Africa. Japan, once a minor destination, increased its imports by about 26% in early 2024. A clear sign that international buyers saw reliability where others saw risk. New trade deals with countries like Germany and South Korea soon followed, opening new pathways for growth and reinforcing Canada's reputation as a sustainable, trusted supplier of construction materials. At home, major forestry companies and port authorities in Vancouver and Prince Rupert invested heavily in modernization to handle the growing volume of overseas trade. Every shipment leaving Canadian shores came to represent more than just commerce. It symbolized a shift in national identity. Canada was no longer defined by dependence on its southern neighbor. It was becoming a confident global supplier, ready to compete well beyond North America. Meanwhile, the United States faced the unintended consequences of its own policy. Across the housing industry, frustration mounted. Builders in states like Texas, Ohio, and Florida reported delays, ballooning budgets, and halted projects. The National Association of Home Builders estimated that for every 1% rise in lumber costs, the price of a new home increased by about $1,000. When prices surged towards $765 per thousand board feet, that translated into roughly $10,000 added to the cost of an average home, without any improvement in materials or quality. Across Western Canada, lumber mills began to modernize, shifting their focus from raw material exports to high-value products like engineered wood and premium timber components. This transformation reflected a broader industrial strategy: move up the value chain and compete through innovation rather than volume. Each new trade deal carried more than just economic weight. It symbolized Canada's evolving role in the global economy. The country that once depended almost entirely on American demand was now shaping its own future through diversification, resilience, and strategic growth. Meanwhile, the U.S. construction sector was entering a period of uncertainty. Lumber prices continued to rise, making home ownership increasingly unattainable for many families and forcing builders to scale back or abandon projects nationwide. Housing developments slowed or halted as domestic production failed to close the widening supply gap. Contractors faced mounting expenses, banks grew hesitant to finance new builds, and potential homeowners watched as prices drifted further out of reach. The dream of owning a home, once central to the American identity, was slipping away. Canada's evolution represented more than just economic recovery. It marked a shift in global influence. As the world struggled with unstable supply chains and growing geopolitical risks, the value of reliability soared. Canada's reputation as a dependable, sustainable supplier became one of its greatest strengths. International partners turned to Ottawa not only for materials, but for long-term stability in their housing and infrastructure plans. Dependability had quietly become a new form of power, one that allowed Canada to expand its reach while others faltered. In Washington, the tone was beginning to change. Officials who once celebrated tariffs as a symbol of strength now faced mounting criticism from builders, unions, and economists who saw the strategy backfiring. The very measures designed to boost self-sufficiency were instead exposing the system's fragility. High construction costs, labor shortages, and limited domestic production created a vicious cycle that seemed impossible to break. As frustration grew, the conversation shifted from protectionism to accountability, forcing policymakers to ask whether the approach had ever been sustainable. What began as a plan to defend American industry had turned into a struggle with its own unintended consequences. Across the continent, the results of this grand economic experiment were plain to see in every half-finished neighborhood and delayed infrastructure project. Housing shortages deepened, trade routes were redrawn, and Canada, once seen as the junior partner in the lumber trade, suddenly held the upper hand. Its strategy of diversification had transformed a moment of pressure into a global opportunity. For the first time in decades, Canada was no longer defined by its connection to the U.S. housing market. It was carving out its own place in the global economy, guided by innovation, environmental responsibility, and an expanding network of international partners. This transformation reshaped how both nations saw themselves. In Canada, new investments in green technology and sustainable forestry turned the lumber sector into a model of long-term planning and forward thinking. In the United States, debates grew louder over how to reverse course without admitting defeat. The irony was hard to ignore. Tariffs meant to weaken Canada had instead strengthened it. Every new deal signed in Tokyo, Berlin, or Seoul underscored how quickly global power can shift when strategy aligns with opportunity. And every stalled project in America served as a reminder of how deeply interconnected modern economies have become. What began as a trade dispute had evolved into a powerful lesson in foresight. For Canada, adaptation became its greatest strength. For the United States, resistance became its weakness. The divide between the two nations was no longer just about lumber. It symbolized two very different ways of responding to a changing world. One embraced cooperation and innovation. The other clung to isolation and control. And the consequences of those choices were playing out in real time. Now, a question lingers across every boardroom, policy meeting, and construction site in North America. Did protectionism truly protect American interests? Or did it pave the way for Canada's rise? Because this story was never just about lumber or tariffs. It's about how economic power shifts when old strategies can't keep up with a globalized world. It's about what happens when the walls built to defend a nation end up closing it in. One decision set off a chain reaction that redrew the map of North American trade, turning allies into competitors and reshaping the balance of power for years to come. What do you think about all this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the Timefold channel for more insights like this.